The air in Alistair Finch's penthouse was not meant for human lungs. It was a curated, sterile atmosphere, filtered and chilled to the precise temperature of indifference. It smelled of nothing, which was a scent in itself. The smell of wealth so vast it had scrubbed the world of its textures and imperfections. Sunlight, a raw and chaotic element, was tamed as it passed through the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, falling in neat, geometric patterns across the cold Italian marble floors. From this height, 67 stories above Central Park, New York City was not a living, breathing metropolis, but a silent, intricate scale model, a testament to power and perspective. The furniture was minimalist, each piece a statement of brutalist elegance that cost more than a suburban home, arranged with a precision that discouraged lounging. It was a space designed not for living, but for display, a museum of a man's success, and within its silent, imposing walls, Elena Reyes moved like a ghost, her presence marked only by the absence of a fingerprint on a glass surface or a speck of dust on a steel frame. She was a part of the machinery that kept the void pristine, her movements economical, her expression a carefully maintained mask of professional neutrality. Elena's hands, though calloused from cleaning solutions and repetitive labor, moved with the grace of a surgeon. She polished a chrome faucet not just until it shone, but until it reflected the distorted, silent city without a single streak, a perfect mirror of a world she could see but never touch. In her mind, however, she was not a maid. She was a forensic accountant, a master of numbers and patterns. As she wiped down the quartz countertop, her brain was not processing the simple task but running complex calculations, seeing the entire penthouse not as a home, but as a balance sheet. The art on the wall was an appreciating asset, the custom-built wine cellar, a diversified liquid portfolio, the very air she breathed an overhead expense. This internal world was her sanctuary, the one place Alistair Finch's oppressive influence could not reach. It was where she kept her true self alive, the brilliant university prodigy who could once dissect a hostile takeover strategy with the same ease she now used to organize a spice rack. This duality was her armor, the quiet, invisible servant on the outside, and the sharp, analytical mind burning within, waiting for a purpose beyond survival. Her purpose had a name, Daniel Reyes, her father. The image of him was a constant, shimmering presence behind her eyes, a ghost that fueled every menial task. She didn't see the sterile kitchen. She saw the bleached, sterile walls of the long-term care facility. She didn't smell the faint, chemical scent of polish. She smelled the antiseptic that clung to his clothes, his bedsheets, his very skin. She remembered him before, a man whose laughter could fill a factory floor, whose hands, stained with grease and pride, had built a respectable manufacturing firm from the ground up. Then came the ruin. A company called Finch Capital, a name she had never heard before, had appeared like a storm on the horizon. They had used a predatory strategy, a leveraged debt spiral, that was technically legal but morally bankrupt, to seize control, strip the assets, and leave the company a hollowed-out carcass. The shock of losing his life's work, the legacy he meant to leave her, had triggered the stroke, silencing his booming laughter forever and leaving him trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him. Elena had abandoned her own rocketing career, trading a future of corner offices and stock options for one of bleach and quiet desperation, all to pay for the medical care that kept the faint light in her father's eyes from extinguishing completely. In the vast, silent expanse of the penthouse there was one small, flickering source of warmth, Lily, Alistair's 8-year-old daughter. She was a miniature ghost in this grand mausoleum, a child with her father's serious eyes but none of his coldness. She was often left in the care of a rotating cast of nannies who treated her more like an asset to be managed than a child to be loved. But with Elena, Lily was different. She would follow the maid from room to room, a silent shadow, her loneliness a palpable thing. Today, the private chef had left Lily a deconstructed lunch of seared scallops and microgreens, a meal as cold and pretentious as the apartment itself. The child had pushed it away, her lower lip trembling, So Elena had done what felt natural. She sat on the floor with the girl, in the cavernous kitchen, and shared her own meal. Simple rice and beans, packed in a worn plastic container, seasoned with the memory of her mother's cooking. The two of them sat cross-legged on the cold marble, a tiny island of genuine human connection in an ocean of sterile opulence. Lily's small, happy sighs filling the silence as she ate the humble food with more enthusiasm than she ever showed for her gourmet meals. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The sudden, soft chime of the private elevator was an intrusion, a sound that sliced through the quiet warmth of the kitchen. Alistair Finch was home early. He strode into the apartment not like a man returning to his sanctuary, but like a general inspecting his barracks. He was a man tailored to perfection, his suit a razor-sharp armor of dark gray wool, his shoes clicking against the marble with an aggressive, rhythmic cadence. He was followed by another man, a potential business partner, whose expression was a mixture of awe at the surroundings and deference to the man who commanded them. Alistair's presence seemed to suck the very warmth from the air. He moved with an aura of absolute control, his eyes sweeping across his domain, cataloging, assessing, judging. His gaze was a physical weight, and when it fell upon the kitchen it stopped. The rhythmic clicking of his shoes ceased. The air, already thin at this altitude, became heavy, thick with a sudden, dangerous pressure that promised a violent storm. He didn't shout. Shouting was for people who had lost control, and Alistair Finch was always in control. Instead, a chilling stillness descended upon him. His jaw tightened, a single muscle flexing in his temple. He saw not a moment of kindness, but a breakdown in protocol. He saw not his lonely daughter finding comfort, but his authority being undermined. He saw his maid, a piece of hired help, contaminating his pristine environment, and worse, his bloodline, with her commonness. The partner beside him shifted uncomfortably, averting his gaze as if witnessing something deeply inappropriate. In that frozen moment, just as the first wave of cold fury was about to crest into a torrent of dismissive words, his daughter's voice, clear and innocent, pierced the tension. Lily looked up at Elena, her face bright with a genuine smile that was so rarely seen in this house. "This is better than my fancy lunch," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast kitchen. "Thank you for sharing." The words, meant as a simple, heartfelt thanks, were, to Alistair, the most profound public condemnation. They were an indictment of everything his wealth was supposed to provide, a declaration that the simple offering of a servant held more value than all his curated luxury. The humiliation was instantaneous and absolute. In front of a key business partner, his entire world, built on the premise of providing the best of everything, was exposed as a gilded cage that failed to satisfy the simple needs of his own child. The rage that followed was not hot and explosive, but cold and surgical. He had to reassert dominance, to excise the source of this embarrassment immediately. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze fixed on Elena, but his words were a performance for his partner. He pointed a finger, its tip sharp and accusatory. "You," he began, his voice low and laced with contempt, "are fired. Your conduct is grossly inappropriate. You are paid to clean my home, not to stage pathetic little picnics on my kitchen floor and undermine my parental authority." Each word was a perfectly polished stone, hurled with the intent to wound, to diminish, to erase her. He didn't see a woman. He saw a malfunction in his system, a problem to be swiftly and ruthlessly eliminated before it could cause further damage to his image. As the cruel words washed over her, Elena did not flinch, she did not cry. A strange and terrible calm settled deep within her bones. The cold of the marble floor seemed to seep into her veins, solidifying into a resolve of pure, unyielding ice. Her heart, instead of racing with fear or shame, began to beat with a slow, powerful, and steady rhythm, like a war drum sounding in the distance. In her mind's eye, the image of Alistair Finch, with his expensive suit and his casual cruelty, began to blur and merge with the memory of the faceless legal documents that had destroyed her father's life. The contempt in his voice was the same contempt written in the fine print of the takeover contracts. The arrogant wave of his hand, dismissing her from his life, was the same dismissive stroke of a pen that had ruined her family. This man was not just a bad boss, he was the architect of her suffering. The humiliation was no longer a personal wound, it was a call to arms. The grief and helplessness she had carried for years began to transform, molecule by molecule, into a silent, focused, and unquenchable fury. She rose to her feet with a grace that seemed to defy her station, her movements fluid and deliberate, no longer the shuffling gait of an invisible servant. She met Alistair's gaze, her own eyes clear and unblinking, holding a depth of intelligence and strength he was utterly incapable of perceiving. He saw only a maid he had put back in her place. He turned away from her, his dismissal complete, and placed a condescending hand on his partner's shoulder, guiding him toward the living area to resume their important discussion. "Apologies for that," Alistair said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Now, as I was saying about the new acquisition, the key is the leveraged debt spiral. It's an older play, a bit obscure, but brutally effective for maximizing our extraction of value before the target entity even realizes what's happening." He spoke the words with a smug satisfaction, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just handed the master key of his own destruction to the woman standing silently behind him, the woman whose entire world had been shattered by that exact, obscure, and brutally effective strategy. The game had just begun. As Alistair Finch pivoted away, the sound of his voice explaining the intricacies of the leveraged debt spiral became a strange, distorted echo in Elena's ears. It was as if the world had suddenly been submerged in deep water. The ambient noise of the penthouse, the hum of the climate control, the distant sigh of city traffic, fading into a muted roar. Only his words remained, sharp and clear, piercing the veil of her carefully constructed composure. Leveraged debt spiral. The phrase was not just a piece of financial jargon. It was a ghost, a three-word incantation that had summoned the ruin of her entire world. It was the precise mechanism, the obscure and predatory weapon that had been used to disembowel her father's company, Reyes Manufacturing. In that moment, the sterile, opulent kitchen ceased to exist. She was transported back 7 years, standing in the hollowed-out shell of her father's factory, the air thick with the metallic scent of cold machinery and the palpable silence of broken dreams. The name on the predatory firm's documents had been a shell corporation, a ghost entity, but the strategy, she now realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and electrifying, had Alistair Finch's signature all over it. The man who had just fired her for sharing a meal with his lonely daughter was the same man who had pushed her father into a living death. A transformation began within her, a profound and seismic shift that started in the marrow of her bones and radiated outward. The subservient posture she had perfected over years of thankless service jobs melted away, her shoulders straightening, her spine aligning into a column of pure, unyielding steel. She lifted her head, and the gaze she fixed upon Alistair's back was no longer that of a dismissed maid, but of a predator that had just identified its prey. The fury that had been a slow-burning ember in her soul for 7 long years now ignited, but it was not a wild, uncontrolled fire. It was a cold blue flame of absolute focus, burning away every last vestige of fear, of doubt, of helplessness. She took a single, silent step forward, the soft sole of her worn shoe making no sound on the polished marble. The movement was so deliberate, so freighted with newfound purpose, that it seemed to carry an invisible weight, a shift in the room's gravitational pull. Alistair's partner, the guest, felt it first, a prickling on the back of his neck, a subconscious signal that the power dynamic in the room had just been irrevocably altered. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes widening slightly at the woman who now stood there, an entirely different person from the one he had seen on the floor moments ago. Elena's voice, when it came, was unrecognizable. It was not the quiet, deferential tone of a servant. It was a voice honed in university debate halls and corporate boardrooms, a voice of calm, crystalline precision that cut through Alistair's self-satisfied monologue like a diamond blade through glass. She did not address him. Instead, she spoke directly to his partner, a strategic choice that immediately shifted the balance of power, creating an intellectual triangle where Alistair was suddenly on the outside. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her tone measured and professional. "Forgive the interruption, but I believe Mr. Finch is misrepresenting the stability of the Beringer account acquisition. The use of their names, the formal address, the immediate dive into the heart of their business, it was a stunning gambit." Alistair froze mid-sentence, his hand still resting on Harrison's shoulder. He turned his head slowly, a look of profound, almost comical disbelief contorting his features. He saw the same uniform, the same woman, but he heard the voice of an equal, a peer, an expert. The cognitive dissonance was so jarring that for a moment he was rendered utterly speechless, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the help with the confident, authoritative sound that was now filling his pristine, controlled environment with an unwelcome and undeniable intelligence. Mr. Harrison, a seasoned investor in his own right, was momentarily confused, but his instincts told him to listen. There was a conviction in Elena's voice that demanded attention. She continued, her gaze locked on him, her expression one of serene, almost academic focus. "The leveraged debt spiral model Mr. Finch is proposing relies on a projected third-quarter revenue stream from Beringer's European subsidiary. That projection, however, is based on outdated market data from before the new German tariffs were announced last Tuesday." She paused, letting the weight of that single specific fact settle in the silent room. "Those tariffs will place a 17% levy on Beringer's primary export, effectively wiping out their profit margin and rendering the subsidiary insolvent within 6 months. The debt you are leveraging is therefore secured against an asset that is, for all intents and purposes, already worthless." Every word was a hammer blow, dismantling Alistair's entire pitch with cold, hard, verifiable facts. She wasn't offering an opinion. She was delivering a verdict. The air in the penthouse crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with a maid being fired, and everything to do with a multi-billion-dollar deal suddenly teetering on the brink of collapse, exposed by the last person on Earth anyone would have expected. Alistair's face, which had been a mask of smug superiority, began to crumble. The blood drained from it, leaving a sickly, pale sheen under the recessed lighting. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The carefully constructed image of the untouchable titan of industry was being systematically disassembled in front of a crucial partner. Elena wasn't finished. She took another step, her presence now commanding the center of the vast living space. "Furthermore," she added, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more conspiratorial, drawing Mr. Harrison in even further, "the shell corporation being used to absorb the initial debt, Apex Holdings, has a registered address in the Cayman Islands that corresponds to a post office box that has been flagged by Interpol for its connection to money laundering schemes in Eastern Europe. To proceed with this acquisition as structured would not only be financially catastrophic, it would expose Finch Capital and its partners to a level of legal and regulatory scrutiny that would be, to put it mildly, career-ending." She had moved beyond a simple financial analysis and into the realm of criminal conspiracy, laying his entire, rotten enterprise bare, with the detached precision of a surgeon performing an autopsy. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where Alistair Finch's reputation and power had once been. Mr. Harrison slowly, deliberately removed Alistair's hand from his shoulder. He took a step back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the professional chasm that had just opened between them. He looked from Elena, whose expression remained one of unshakable calm, to Alistair, whose face was now a swirling vortex of fury, humiliation, and disbelief. The awe he had felt for Finch had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating suspicion. This woman, this maid, had, in less than 60 seconds, demonstrated a more profound and detailed understanding of the deal than the man who had spent months trying to sell it to him. He didn't know who she was, but he knew she was right. The details she had provided, the German tariffs, the specific name of the shell corporation, were too precise to be a lucky guess. They were the hallmarks of deep, expert analysis. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Alistair?" he said, his voice now stripped of all its earlier deference. "I think we need to postpone this discussion indefinitely." He gave Elena a final, lingering look, a mixture of astonishment and profound respect in his eyes, before turning and walking briskly toward the private elevator without another word, leaving Alistair alone in the wreckage of his own arrogance. The moment the elevator doors chimed shut, sealing Alistair in with the source of his utter humiliation, the dam of his control broke. The cold, surgical anger was gone, replaced by a hot, primal rage that twisted his handsome features into an ugly mask. His entire body trembled, not with fear, but with the sheer force of his fury. He was a king whose crown had been snatched away by a peasant in his own throne room. The intellectual and social order of his universe had been turned upside down, and he could not comprehend it. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, the words tearing from his throat, raw and guttural. It was not a question born of curiosity, but an accusation, a demand that she explain her impossible existence. He advanced on her, his fists clenched at his sides, his 6-foot frame seeming to swell with a palpable menace. But Elena did not retreat. She stood her ground, a small, unmovable island in the storm of his rage, her calm gaze meeting his fiery one without a flicker of intimidation. The power dynamic had been permanently inverted. He might own the building, but in that moment, she owned the room. "My name is Elena Reyes," she said, her voice still perfectly level, each syllable a small polished stone, "and I am the woman you just fired." She offered no further explanation, no hint of her background, or the true source of her knowledge. The simplicity of her answer was more infuriating to him than any insult. It denied him the satisfaction of a complex conspiracy, leaving him with the bald, indigestible fact that he had been undone by his own cleaning lady. The thought was so galling, so fundamentally offensive to his worldview, that his rage boiled over. He pointed a trembling finger toward the door, his voice cracking with the strain of his fury. "Get out!" he hissed. "Get out of my building. You are finished. Do you hear me? I will personally make a few calls. You won't find a job cleaning toilets in this city when I'm done with you. I will erase you." The threat was vast, disproportionate, the desperate lashing out of a man who had lost control and was trying to reclaim it through brute force and intimidation. The only language he truly understood when his veneer of sophisticated genius was stripped away. Elena simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement. She did not argue or plead. She had already won the battle that mattered. She had planted the seed of doubt, shattered his deal, and revealed the man behind the curtain. As she walked toward the service entrance, she could feel his hateful glare burning into her back. But it no longer felt like a weight. It felt like fuel. His threat was not a curse. It was a promise of war, and it was a war she was now fully prepared to fight. The humiliation he had intended for her had been returned to him 1,000-fold, and the despair she should have felt at being fired and threatened was replaced by a sense of profound, liberating clarity. For 7 years, she had been a ghost, haunting the edges of her own life, defined by grief and duty. Now Alistair Finch, in his infinite arrogance, had given her a new identity. He had made her his enemy, and he had no idea how formidable an enemy she was about to become. The quiet click of the service door closing behind her was not an ending, but the starting pistol for the race of his life. The journey home on the subway was a surreal experience, a descent from the sterile, silent heights of the 67th floor into the vibrant, chaotic, and fiercely alive heart of the city. The screech of the train's wheels on the tracks, the cacophony of a dozen languages being spoken at once, the press of humanity all around her. It should have been overwhelming, but instead, it felt grounding. It was real. Unlike the artificial world of Alistair Finch's penthouse, this world was messy, imperfect, and full of struggle, but it was also full of life. Elena leaned her head against the cool glass of the subway car window, watching the dark tunnels flash by, interspersed with the bright, fleeting mosaics of station platforms. The faces of the people around her were etched with the stories of their own battles, exhaustion, worry, but also resilience and hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt a part of it, not just an observer. The invisible uniform she had worn for so long had been torn away, and while the future was terrifyingly uncertain, she was, at her core, finally free. Her apartment was a small, third-floor walk-up in Queens, a world away from the panoramic views of Central Park. It was sparsely furnished, every object within its walls chosen for its utility rather than its beauty. Yet, it was a home, filled with the faint, comforting sense of her father's old books and the lingering aroma of the rice and beans she cooked in batches for the week. The moment she closed the door behind her, locking out the noise of the city, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation began to recede, and the cold, hard reality of her situation washed over her like a tidal wave. She had no job. The next payment for her father's care facility was due in 2 weeks, a sum of $4,750 that was now an impossible mountain to climb. Alistair Finch's threat echoed in her mind. "You won't find a job cleaning toilets in this city." He had the power, the connections, the sheer vindictive will to make that threat a reality. A wave of dizziness and nausea swept over her, and she had to brace herself against the wall, her knuckles white as she gripped the peeling paint of the door frame. For a long, silent moment, despair was a physical presence in the small room, a suffocating blanket that threatened to smother the fire that had been lit within her. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sharp, blurring the familiar outlines of her tiny living room. She thought of her father, of his vacant eyes, and the slight, hopeful pressure of his hand in hers. The only communication he had left. What had she done? She had indulged in a moment of righteous defiance, a fleeting taste of victory, but at what cost? Had she doomed him? Had her pride condemned the man she loved to a lesser standard of care? Or worse, the weight of her responsibility, of his utter dependence on her, pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The image of Lily, Alistair's daughter, flashed in her mind, a small, lonely girl who had found a moment of happiness in a shared, simple meal. She had not only lost her livelihood, she had left that child alone again in that cold, empty museum of a home. The complexity of the situation, the collateral damage of her actions, was a bitter pill to swallow. But as she stood there, trembling on the precipice of utter collapse, another image rose to meet the despair, pushing back against it with an undeniable force. It was the memory of Alistair's face as his perfect world shattered around him. The shock, the fury, the raw, undiluted humiliation. It was the face of a bully who had just been punched in the mouth for the first time. And she remembered the feeling that had bloomed in her own chest in that moment. Not just vengeance, but justice. A sense that the universe, for one brief, shining instant, had been set right. The tears that had threatened to fall now receded, the heat behind her eyes cooling and hardening into something else. The despair was still there, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer all-encompassing. It now had a companion, a cold, hard, and utterly ruthless determination. Alistair Finch had not just taken her job, he had declared war on her existence. He had threatened to erase her, and in doing so, he had made a fatal error. He had given her nothing left to lose. She pushed herself off the wall, her movements now steady and purposeful. She crossed the small room to an old, battered wooden chest that sat under the window, a relic from her childhood home. Kneeling on the worn rug, she lifted the heavy lid. The air that rose from it smelled of dust and old paper, the scent of a life that had been packed away and forgotten. Inside, beneath old photo albums and her university diploma, were several accordion files, their labels written in her father's once strong, bold handwriting. She pulled one out, the cardboard soft with age. The label read, Reyes Manufacturing Acquisition Files, 2017. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, but her resolve was firm. For years she had been unable to look at these documents. It was too painful, a tangible reminder of everything they had lost. But now she looked at them with new eyes, not as a grieving daughter, but as a forensic accountant with a case to solve. The fight was no longer about a lost job or a personal insult. It was about reclaiming a stolen legacy. She spread the documents across her small kitchen table, the harsh fluorescent light overhead casting sharp shadows on the yellowing pages. There were legal notices, asset transfer statements, letters from lawyers filled with impenetrable jargon. But to Elena, it was a language she understood better than any other. Her mind, sharp and analytical, began to work, connecting dots that had long been obscured by grief. She saw the name of the shell corporation, Apex Holdings, the same one Alistair had mentioned just hours ago. She saw the timeline, the rapid, aggressive stripping of assets, the deliberate loading of debt onto the company, until it collapsed under its own weight. It was all there, a perfect, textbook example of a leveraged debt spiral, executed with brutal efficiency. Seeing the proof in black and white, confirming the link between the man in the penthouse and the destruction of her family, did not bring her pain. It brought a strange, cold comfort. Her enemy had a name, her fight had a target, and she had a purpose that transcended mere survival. She worked through the night, the city outside her window growing quiet as the hours ticked by. Fueled by black coffee and a righteous fury, she created a new file, this one on her laptop. She began building a timeline, cross-referencing the documents from her father's file with public records she could access through online databases. She searched for every mention of Finch Capital, of Alistair Finch, of Apex Holdings. A web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and suspiciously timed bankruptcies began to emerge. It was a complex and deliberately opaque structure, designed to hide and protect the predator at its center. But Elena could see the patterns, she could follow the money. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind a whirlwind of calculations and connections. The sun was beginning to cast a pale, gray light over the rooftops of Queens when she finally leaned back in her chair, her eyes burning with fatigue but her mind sharper than ever. She had the skeleton of his operation. But a skeleton wasn't enough. She needed irrefutable proof, the kind of evidence that could not be dismissed or buried by high-priced lawyers. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed resources she no longer had access to. Subscription-based financial databases, legal archives, and most importantly, guidance. There was only one person she could turn to, one person who had always believed in her potential and who possessed an unshakable moral compass. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over a name she hadn't called in years. Professor James Albright, her former mentor at Columbia University, a man renowned for his work in business ethics and corporate accountability. He had been her fiercest advocate, the one who had told her she had the sharpest financial mind he had seen in 30 years of teaching. Calling him now felt like admitting defeat, like returning as a failure from the brilliant future he had predicted for her. A wave of shame washed over her. What would he think of her, the prodigy who had ended up as a maid? But she pushed the feeling down. This was not about her pride. It was about justice for her father. With a deep breath, she pressed the call button, the electronic ringing sounding like a drumbeat marking the start of a new, dangerous phase of her campaign. The phone rang 4 times, each one stretching into an eternity. Elena was about to hang up, her nerve failing her, when a gruff, sleepy voice answered. Albright. It was him. His voice was exactly as she remembered, sharp and impatient, even when roused from sleep. "Professor Albright," she began, her own voice sounding small and unsteady to her ears. "It's Elena Reyes, from the class of 2016. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he wouldn't remember her. Then, his voice changed, a note of warmth and surprise cutting through the early morning gruffness. "Elena? My goodness. It's been a long time. I always wondered what happened to you. The firm that snatched you up said you left after a few months. Are you all right?" The genuine concern in his voice was almost her undoing. It was a kindness she was not prepared for, a reminder of a life where she was seen and valued for her mind. She swallowed hard, forcing the lump in her throat down. "I'm okay, Professor, but I need your help. I've stumbled into something big. It involves a man named Alistair Finch." She met him that afternoon in his office at the university. The room was a chaotic sanctuary of knowledge, a stark contrast to the sterile order of Alistair's penthouse. Books were stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. Papers overflowed from filing cabinets, and the air smelled of old paper, coffee, and chalk dust. Professor Albright himself was a man who seemed to be composed of tweed and intellectual fervor, with kind, sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened intently as Elena laid out the entire story, starting with her father's company and ending with the confrontation in the penthouse. She didn't present it as a tale of personal woe. She presented it as a case study, laying out the facts, the timeline, and the financial mechanics of Finch's predatory strategy. She spoke his language, the language of numbers and ethics, of loopholes and legal gray areas. She watched his expression shift from polite interest to deep concentration, then to a dawning horror, and finally to a quiet, simmering anger that matched her own. He saw not a maid seeking revenge, but a brilliant analyst presenting a damning indictment. When she finished, Albright leaned back in his creaking leather chair, steepling his fingers and staring at a point just over her head. The silence in the cluttered office was thick with the weight of her story. He was not just processing the information, he was calculating the risks, the potential consequences, the sheer scale of the power they would be challenging. Alistair Finch was not just a successful businessman, he was an institution, a man with deep connections in finance, politics, and the media. To go against him was to invite a war with a modern-day dragon who could incinerate them with a single phone call. Elena held her breath, her entire future hanging on his next words. She had shown him the path, but she needed him to help her open the gate. He was the key to the resources, the credibility, and the strategic guidance she would need to turn her raw intelligence into an unstoppable weapon. Finally, he brought his gaze down to meet hers, and in his eyes, she saw not pity or doubt, but a familiar glint of academic excitement and moral resolve. "Alistair Finch," he said, his voice a low growl. "I've been hearing whispers about his methods for years. Unsubstantiated, of course. He's very good at covering his tracks." He leaned forward, a fierce light in his eyes. "What he did to your father's company was a travesty, Elena. A perfectly legal, morally bankrupt act of pure economic sadism. But what you've uncovered about this new deal, this connection to Apex Holdings, that's different. That's not just unethical. If you're right, it's felony fraud." He stood up and began to pace the small space between his desk and the door, his energy filling the room. "He underestimated you. That was his mistake. He saw a maid, and he never once thought to look closer. It's the classic hubris of the powerful. They believe the people who serve them are invisible, that they don't have minds, that they don't have histories." He stopped pacing and turned to her, his decision made. "You have my help, Elena, whatever you need. My access to the university's financial databases, my legal contacts, my name. We are going to take every piece of this puzzle you've uncovered, and we are going to find the one piece of evidence that he cannot bury, deny, or escape from. We are going to find the smoking gun." The words filled Elena with a surge of hope so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She was no longer alone. She had an ally, a mentor, a partner in the fight. The path ahead was still fraught with danger, but for the first time, it did not seem impassable. She had the intellect, and now, with Albright's help, she had the resources. The investigation could begin in earnest. The Invisible Woman was about to build a case that would make her the most visible and most feared person in Alistair Finch's world. The first step was to establish a secure base of operations. Professor Albright cleared a corner of his already crowded office, setting up an old but powerful workstation for her. He gave her a login that granted her access to LexisNexis, Bloomberg Terminal, and other high-powered databases that cost thousands of dollars a month, tools that were the exclusive domain of the financial elite. As Elena sat down at the terminal, the familiar glow of the data streams illuminating her face, she felt a part of herself that had been dormant for 7 years awaken. This was her natural habitat. The world of numbers, of stock tickers, of SEC filings and shareholder reports. She was no longer Elena Reyes, the maid. She was Elena Reyes, the forensic accountant, and she was on the hunt. Her first search was a deep dive into the corporate structure of every company Finch Capital had acquired in the last decade. She wasn't just looking for fraud. She was looking for a signature, a repeatable pattern of behavior that would establish a history of predatory practices. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, her eyes scanning lines of code and dense legal text with a speed that would have been dizzying to an ordinary person. She ignored the major, headline-grabbing acquisitions. The real secrets, she knew, were always buried in the smaller, less glamorous deals, the ones that flew under the radar of the financial press. She focused on family-owned businesses, mid-sized manufacturing firms, companies just like her father's. One by one, she pulled their histories, their acquisition reports, their post-takeover performance. A chilling pattern began to emerge. In at least a dozen cases, a company would be acquired, loaded with debt from an obscure offshore entity, stripped of its valuable assets like real estate or intellectual property, and then either bankrupted or sold off as a hollow shell within 18 to 24 months. The offshore entity was always different, a new name registered in a new tax haven, but the methodology was identical. It was Alistair Finch's fingerprint, repeated over and over again. She began to build a spreadsheet, a meticulous and damning ledger of Alistair's hidden career. Each row was a company, a family, a legacy destroyed. She listed the names of the founders, the number of employees laid off, the millions of dollars in pension funds that had vanished. The numbers on the screen were not abstract figures to her. They were human lives. Each data point was a story of ruin, a mirror of her own family's tragedy. The work was emotionally grueling, a journey through a graveyard of corporate ambition that Finch had created. But with each new discovery, her resolve hardened. This was bigger than her father now. This was for every name on her list, for every family that had been torn apart by his insatiable greed. She was not just seeking justice for one man. She was seeking justice for all of his silent, forgotten victims. The weight of this new responsibility settled on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of purpose. After 3 days of relentless work, sleeping only a few hours at a time on the lumpy couch in Albright's office, she found her first major breakthrough. It was buried deep within the fine print of an obscure real estate transfer document related to a bankrupt textile company in North Carolina. A subsidiary of a subsidiary, 6 layers deep in the corporate structure, had been used to purchase the company's factory for a fraction of its assessed value just weeks before the bankruptcy was announced. The name of that subsidiary was Finch Properties, LLC. It was a rookie mistake, a moment of laziness or arrogance, where he had used a name that could be directly traced back to him. It was the first hard link she had found between the offshore entities and Finch Capital itself. It was a single thread, but it was enough. It was the thread she could pull to unravel his entire, carefully woven tapestry of deceit. She showed the document to Professor Albright, pointing to the key line on the screen. He peered at it through his reading glasses, his eyes widening as he understood the significance. "My God," he breathed. He got sloppy. "This is it, Elena." This single line of text, this digital breadcrumb, became the new center of Elena's universe. It was more than a clue. It was a confirmation, a tangible link between the abstract, monstrous entity that had devoured her family's future and the very real, very arrogant man who had dismissed her from his home. The name Finch Properties, LLC, glowed on the monitor in the dim, book-choked office, a beacon in the vast, dark ocean of data she had been navigating. Professor Albright's words echoed in her mind, a validation of the path she had chosen. He got sloppy. The thought was a cold, sharp comfort. It meant Alistair Finch, for all his power and meticulous planning, was human. He was fallible, and a single crack in the foundation of his empire was all she needed to bring the entire edifice crashing down. The hunt had now truly begun, moving from a desperate search for a connection to a focused, strategic pursuit of a specific vulnerability. She felt the shift inside her, the last vestiges of the grieving daughter giving way to the cold, calculating precision of the hunter. Her mission was no longer just to understand what had happened. It was to build a cage of irrefutable facts, a cage from which he could never escape. The days that followed blurred into a single, continuous stretch of time, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun through the dusty panes of Albright's office window. Elena's world shrank to the size of the 24-inch monitor, her reality a cascade of numbers, legal clauses, and corporate filings. She and the professor established a rhythm, a silent partnership fueled by lukewarm coffee and a shared sense of righteous purpose. He would use his academic credentials to request archived documents and public records that were not available online, his presence lending a legitimacy to their inquiries that she, a former maid, could never have achieved alone. She, in turn, would take the raw data he procured and weave it into the larger tapestry of her investigation. Her mind became a loom, pulling threads from a dozen different sources: property deeds from North Carolina, incorporation papers from Delaware, shipping manifests from a bankrupt logistics firm in Ohio, and seeing how they interconnected, how they all ultimately led back to the nexus of Finch Capital. It was painstaking, soul-crushing work, each document a new story of a family business gutted, of employees cast aside, of communities left to wither. The weight of these stories pressed down on her, but it did not crush her. It forged her resolve into something harder than steel. Following the trail of Finch Properties, LLC, Elena began to map out a shadow network of Alistair's corporate structure. It was a masterpiece of obfuscation, a hydra with 100 different heads, each one a legally distinct entity designed to insulate the others from liability. She used specialized software, provided by Albright, to create a visual chart of the connections. What started as a simple line between Finch Capital and Finch Properties soon blossomed into a terrifyingly complex web, sprawling across the digital whiteboard like a cancerous growth. Shell corporations in the Cayman Islands fed into holding companies in Panama, which in turn were linked to asset management firms in Switzerland. It was a closed loop, a self-sustaining ecosystem of greed designed to move money with the speed and untraceability of a ghost. She could see the flow, the way assets were stripped from acquired companies and funneled through this labyrinth until they emerged, clean and untraceable, in accounts controlled by Alistair himself. She could see the crime, she could feel its shape and its weight, but she could not yet prove it. The final, crucial links were hidden behind impenetrable firewalls of international banking law. The frustration was a physical thing, a tight, burning knot in her chest. She had the entire blueprint of his criminal enterprise laid out before her, a detailed map of his sins, yet the final piece of evidence, the direct, undeniable proof of his personal involvement in criminal intent, remained just out of reach. It was like standing before a locked vault, knowing the treasure was inside, but having no key. Every path she followed eventually led to a numbered Swiss account or a corporate entity protected by laws that made a mockery of transparency. She spent a week chasing one promising lead, a wire transfer from Apex Holdings to a company in Liechtenstein, only to find the company had been dissolved 3 years prior, its records legally expunged. The digital trail went cold, and the silence that followed was deafening. In that moment of defeat, her exhaustion washed over her, and the image of her father's frail form in the sterile hospital bed flooded her mind. She was so close, yet for him, time was a luxury she did not have. The thought of failing him, of his justice remaining unfulfilled, was an agony far worse than any professional setback. It was Professor Albright who broke the spell of her despair. He had been watching her for hours, seeing the toll the relentless work and the repeated dead ends were taking. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch a grounding force in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. "He built these walls from the outside, Elena," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We're never going to break them down by force from out here. We need someone who is, or was, on the inside. Someone who knows where the secret door is." His words were a life raft in the storm. Of course. She had been so focused on the data, on the digital trail, that she had forgotten the human element. A system this complex, this corrupt, could not be run by one man alone. It required accountants, lawyers, assistants, people who had to see the transactions, process the paperwork, and live with the moral compromises every single day. Somewhere within that network of complicity, there had to be a weak link. There had to be someone with a conscience. Their new strategy was born from this realization. The hunt shifted from digital archives to human histories. They began compiling a list of former high-level employees of Finch Capital, specifically those who had left the company abruptly or under contentious circumstances over the past decade. They cross-referenced the names with public records, looking for signs of financial distress or legal trouble that might make someone more willing to talk. It was a delicate and dangerous phase of the investigation. A single misstep, a single phone call to the wrong person, and Alistair would be alerted that someone was digging into his past. They had to be surgical, approaching only the most promising candidates with the utmost discretion. After several days of careful vetting, they settled on a name: Marcus Thorne. He had been a senior risk analyst at Finch Capital for 5 years before resigning suddenly 2 years ago, citing, quote, personal reasons. His digital footprint showed he had been unemployed ever since, a highly unusual situation for someone with his qualifications and experience. He was their best shot. Professor Albright, with his unimpeachable reputation, made the initial contact. He sent a carefully worded email to Marcus, framing the inquiry as academic research into aggressive private equity strategies. He offered a generous stipend for a confidential interview, a lure for a man they suspected was in financial trouble. To their immense relief, Marcus agreed to meet. They chose a neutral location, a quiet, forgotten corner of the New York Public Library, a place of hushed tones and scholarly anonymity. Elena felt a tremor of nervous energy as she saw him approach their designated table. He was a man who looked older than his 45 years, with tired eyes and a slump to his shoulders that spoke of a deep, abiding weariness. He was the ghost of a man who had seen too much, a man haunted by the choices he had made and the things he had been forced to ignore. He radiated an aura of fear and paranoia, his gaze constantly darting around the cavernous reading room, as if he expected Alistair Finch himself to materialize from behind a bookshelf. Elena led the conversation, her voice low and empathetic. She didn't begin with accusations or demands. She began by talking about her father. She told Marcus the story of Reyes Manufacturing, of a good company and a proud man destroyed by a financial strategy so predatory it was tantamount to theft. She watched as a flicker of recognition, of pained memory, crossed his face. He remembered the name. It was one of dozens, a transaction from long ago, but he remembered. The shared humanity of her story, the raw and honest grief in her voice, began to chip away at the wall of fear he had built around himself. He saw in her not a threat, but a kindred spirit, another victim of the same destructive force that had derailed his own life. He had not been fired for incompetence, he explained, his voice barely a whisper. He had been forced out after he raised ethical concerns about the very deal that had ruined her father's company. He had been made to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and was given a severance package that was, in reality, hush money, with the implicit threat of total financial and professional ruin if he ever spoke a word of what he knew. He was terrified, his hands trembling as he clutched a cold cup of coffee. He was convinced Alistair had eyes and ears everywhere, that this meeting was some kind of elaborate trap. Elena looked him in the eye, her own gaze steady and unwavering. "He has already taken everything from you, Marcus," she said softly, but with an edge of steel. "Your career, your peace of mind. He is still controlling you with a fear that you carry around every single day. The only way to be free is to help me stop him from doing to anyone else what he did to us." Her words struck a chord deep within him, appealing not to his greed or his fear, but to the last, flickering ember of his professional integrity. He was silent for a long time, his internal battle playing out across his tormented features. Finally, he let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of surrender and release. He wouldn't testify, he said. He was too scared for his family. But he would give her something. A key. Not a password, but a piece of knowledge. A secret about Alistair's obsessive, narcissistic nature that might just be the opening she needed. "Alistair is a creature of habit and ego," Marcus whispered, leaning across the table, his voice urgent. "Everything in his digital world is organized by a single principle, his own legacy. He names his secure servers after battles he has won. Not famous historical battles, but his own corporate takeovers. The server that holds the ghost ledgers, the real books, is named after the acquisition he is most proud of, the one he considers his masterpiece, the one that launched his entire empire." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with a look of profound meaning. "He calls it Project Reyes." The name hit Elena with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The masterpiece of his legacy was the tombstone of hers. The source of his greatest pride was the source of her deepest pain. He had taken their name, their history, and twisted it into a monument to his own cruelty. The revelation was so monstrous, so deeply personal, that it transcended fury. It became a cold, clarifying certainty. She would not just expose him. She would dismantle his legacy, piece by piece, using the very name he had stolen from her. Returning to the office, the atmosphere was thick, with a new, electric tension. The name Project Reyes was more than a clue. It was a desecration, a final insult that fueled Elena's determination to a fever pitch. She sat at the terminal, her fingers poised over the keyboard. Accessing Finch Capital's internal servers was impossible from the outside, but Marcus had given her one more piece of the puzzle. He had told her about a rarely used back-end portal for external auditors, a digital doorway that was often overlooked in routine security sweeps. It was still protected by a formidable encryption wall, but it was a single door, not an entire fortress. Professor Albright, using a contact in the university's cybersecurity department, managed to acquire a piece of software, a brute force decryption program that could run millions of password combinations. But it was slow, and it risked tripping the system's silent alarms. They needed to be smarter. They couldn't just guess. They needed to think like Alistair Finch. Elena closed her eyes, shutting out the cluttered office, and pictured the man himself, his arrogance, his obsession with control, his belief in his own genius. The password wouldn't be random. It would be something meaningful to him, something that fed his ego. She thought about the name of the server, Project Reyes. It was about his victory, his beginning. She began to input a series of logical combinations. The date of the acquisition, the final sale price, the stock ticker symbol of her father's company. Each attempt was met with the same cold, digital rejection. Access denied. Hours bled into one another. The decryption software ran in the background, a slow, methodical churn of possibilities, but Elena felt a growing certainty that the answer was simpler, more personal. She pulled up the old files from her father's company, her eyes scanning the familiar documents until they landed on one she had overlooked. It was the final letter from the board, the formal notice of the takeover, a document that effectively signed the death warrant of Reyes Manufacturing. And at the bottom there was a date. Not the date the deal closed, but the date the hostile takeover was initiated, the day the battle began. Her heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She thought of what Marcus had said. He names them after battles he has won. For Alistair, the victory wasn't the final signature. It was the first shot fired, the moment he knew he had his prey cornered. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed in the sequence of numbers, a date that had been burned into her memory as the beginning of her family's end. She typed the name of the project, followed by the date, with no spaces, no special characters, just a clean, arrogant declaration of his conquest. Project Reyes 04112017. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Her entire investigation, her entire hope for justice, balanced on this single, intuitive guess. Then, with a quiet prayer to her father, she pressed the enter key. For a moment, nothing happened. The screen remained frozen. And then, 2 words appeared, glowing in a soft green font against the black background. Access granted. A wave of light-headedness washed over her. A mixture of shock, triumph, and a profound, soul-deep validation. She was in. The ghost ledger was exactly as Marcus had described it. It was an immaculate, parallel set of financial records, hidden in plain sight within the server's directory, disguised under the innocuous file name Quarterly Expense Projections. But the moment she opened it, she knew she had found the heart of his criminal enterprise. It was all there, laid out in cold, hard numbers. Undervalued asset transfers, illegal offshore tax shelters, kickbacks from investment banks, and most damning of all, a detailed record of the deliberate, systematic fraud used in the Barringer account acquisition, the very deal she had blown up in his penthouse. The ledger showed a clear and undeniable conspiracy to deceive investors by using falsified revenue projections from the European subsidiary, the exact flaw she had identified on instinct alone. But here was the proof, a detailed accounting of the crime, with dates, names, and exact figures. It was the smoking gun. It was the weapon she would use to execute his corporate empire. She worked feverishly through the night, downloading every file, every spreadsheet, every incriminating email she could find. She created multiple encrypted backups, storing them on separate drives, and uploading a final copy to a secure cloud server accessible only by her and Professor Albright. As the first rays of dawn crept over the city, she leaned back in her chair, her body aching with exhaustion, but her mind ablaze. She had it all. The evidence was ironclad, a perfect, unbroken chain of criminality that led directly to Alistair Finch. The quiet satisfaction she felt was immense, but it was not a feeling of personal victory. It was a sense of profound and solemn duty. She was not just a daughter seeking revenge. She was an instrument of justice for every name in that ledger, for every life he had broken in his relentless pursuit of power. The weight of the evidence was now her strength, the proof her shield and her sword. The final phase of their plan began to take shape. Simply leaking the information to the press was not enough. Alistair was a master of public relations and legal maneuvering. He could spin the story, bury it in lawsuits, and dismiss it as the work of a disgruntled former employee. No, the exposure had to be public, undeniable, and delivered in a forum where he could not control the narrative. It had to be a public execution of his reputation, delivered in his own temple of power. Professor Albright made a few calls and confirmed the date and location of Finch Capital's annual shareholder meeting. It was in 3 weeks, at the Grand Hyatt Ballroom in Manhattan. It was the one day of the year Alistair stood before his investors, his board, and the financial press to project an image of infallible genius and unassailable success. It was the perfect stage. It was there, in the heart of his kingdom, surrounded by his courtiers, that the invisible Maid would finally deliver her verdict. To ensure the evidence was not only compelling, but legally sound, they needed one more ally, the validator. Albright reached out to a trusted colleague from his past, a retired SEC enforcement lawyer named Julian Croft, a man legendary for his bulldog tenacity and his incorruptible ethics. They met with him in his wood-paneled study, the air smelling of old leather and justice. Elena presented the case, not as a daughter seeking vengeance, but as a prosecutor laying out her indictment. She walked him through the ghost ledger, the offshore accounts, the pattern of predatory acquisitions, and the specific evidence of fraud in the Behringer deal. Croft listened in absolute silence, his sharp, intelligent eyes scrutinizing every document, every number. When she was finished, he looked up from the files, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "In my 30 years of prosecuting financial crime," quote, he said, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction, "I have never seen a case this clean, this perfect. Mr. Finch is not just going to lose his company. He is going to prison for a very, very long time." With Croft's validation, the plan was locked in. He helped Elena prepare her presentation, transforming the raw data into a clear, concise, and utterly devastating narrative that would be easily understood by everyone in the room, from the most seasoned investor to the cub reporter in the back row. They created slides, charts, and a timeline that laid out Alistair's crimes with irrefutable clarity. As she rehearsed her speech, Elena felt the final pieces of her old self falling away. The quiet, deferential Maid was gone forever, replaced by a woman of purpose and power. She was no longer just Daniel Reyes's daughter. She was the voice for all of Alistair's victims. She would walk into that ballroom not as an accuser, but as a judge. The stage was set, the evidence was prepared, and the protagonist of this story was ready for her final, climactic confrontation. Alistair Finch had threatened to erase her, but in 3 weeks, she was going to be the one to erase his entire world, leaving nothing behind but the truth. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom was a cathedral, built to the god of capital. The air itself seemed gilded, thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged leather from $1,000 briefcases, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. Towering floral arrangements, explosions of white orchids and lilies, stood like silent sentinels between tables draped in heavy cream linen. The clinking of water glasses and the low, confident murmur of hundreds of conversations created a symphony of power, a soundscape for the masters of the universe who had gathered for their annual ritual of self-congratulation. Elena Reyes moved through this environment not as a ghost but as a ghost ship, silent and freighted with a terrible purpose. She wore a simple, dark blue dress, a stark contrast to the designer suits and glittering jewelry that surrounded her. It was a uniform of a different kind, one of quiet dignity and unshakable resolve. Her heart did not race with fear or anxiety. It beat with the slow, steady, powerful rhythm of a siege engine moving into position. She found a seat in the back, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking in every detail. She saw the hungry-eyed journalists from the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, the stoic faces of the board members in the front row, their expressions a carefully curated mask of confidence. And on the brightly lit stage, at the center of it all, stood Alistair Finch, a king surveying his court, bathed in the warm, adoring glow of the spotlights, utterly oblivious to the fact that his executioner was already in the room. Alistair's voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, rolled through the ballroom with a practiced, soothing cadence. He spoke of synergy, of shareholder value, of a future where Finch Capital did not just follow market trends but created them. Behind him, a massive screen displayed a series of slick, animated graphs, all pointing upward in an unrelenting trajectory of success. The numbers were impressive, but Elena knew they were a lie. A beautifully rendered fiction built on a foundation of broken companies and shattered lives. She watched him, not as a victim but as a scientist observing a specimen. She noted the way he used his hands to emphasize a point, the confident tilt of his chin, the easy smile he flashed to the audience. He was a performer of the highest caliber, selling a fantasy of his own genius. He was so wrapped in the myth of Alistair Finch, the untouchable titan, that he had become blind. He could no longer distinguish the truth from his own meticulously crafted narrative. Elena felt a profound and chilling calm settle over her. The fury that had driven her for weeks had cooled, solidifying into something far more potent. A diamond-hard certainty. She was not here to destroy a man. She was here to correct the record, to balance a ledger that had been criminally imbalanced for far too long. The ghosts of the lives he had ruined were with her, their silent witness giving her a strength that no amount of wealth could ever purchase. The moderator announced the beginning of the Q&A session, and Elena felt the world slow down, every sound becoming sharp and distinct as she prepared to rise. The first few questions were predictable, lobbed from fawning analysts and friendly media contacts, designed to let Alistair further expound on his own brilliance. He answered them with effortless charm, his responses polished and reassuring. Then a space opened at the microphone stand in the center aisle. This was her moment. Elena stood, her movement so deliberate that it seemed to draw the attention of those around her. She walked toward the microphone, each step a silent declaration. She could feel the ripple of curiosity in the room, the collective, "Who is she?" whispered between sips of water. The spotlight found her, a circle of intense, white heat that made her feel both exposed and singularly powerful. She placed her hand on the cool, smooth metal of the stand, grounding herself. Her gaze locked with Alistair's across the vast expanse of the ballroom. His expression was one of mild annoyance, the look of a king interrupted by a commoner. He did not recognize her. She was just another anonymous face in the crowd, a nobody. That single, arrogant oversight was the final confirmation she needed. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of electricity and ozone, and spoke, her voice perfectly clear, perfectly calm, and amplified to fill every corner of the silent, expectant room. "Mr. Finch, my name is Elena Reyes." She paused, letting the name settle, a name he had stolen and repurposed for his own glory. "I am the daughter of Daniel Reyes, the founder and owner of Reyes Manufacturing. Perhaps you remember it as your Project Reyes." The shift in the room was instantaneous and absolute. The polite, attentive silence of the shareholders morphed into a thick, charged stillness, heavy with confusion and dawning apprehension. On the stage, Alistair Finch froze. The name, her father's name, finally pierced the thick armor of his ego, a forgotten key turning a rusty lock deep in his memory. For a fleeting second, a flicker of genuine shock, of a long-buried memory unearthed, crossed his face before his mask of corporate composure slammed back into place. But it was too late. Everyone had seen it. Elena did not wait for his response. She had the floor, and she would not yield it. With a quiet click from a small remote in her hand, the massive screen behind Alistair went blank for a second, then lit up not with his company's logo, but with the stark, black and white columns of the ghost ledger. Gasps rippled through the audience. She began to speak, her voice a surgeon's scalpel, laying bare the diseased heart of his empire. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The cold, hard facts were her volume. She explained the Behringer fraud, detailing the falsified revenue projections, the offshore accounts, the deliberate deception of his investors, the very people sitting in the room. Then she went further, connecting it to a decade-long pattern, naming the companies he had gutted, the pension funds he had raided, the lives he had systematically destroyed, all meticulously documented on the screen for the world to see. It was not an accusation. It was a verdict. Alistair's downfall was not a slow crumble, it was a catastrophic implosion. The carefully constructed persona of the infallible genius disintegrated in real time, under the glare of 1,000 camera phones and the horrified stares of his peers. His face, which had been a mask of confident authority, became a canvas of pure, raw panic. The blood drained from it, leaving a waxy, corpse-like pallor under the stage lights. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to command the security to remove this woman, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged. His entire reality was being dismantled, word by word, number by number, by the woman he had dismissed as insignificant, a piece of invisible furniture in his perfect life. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white, as if it were the last solid thing in a world that was dissolving into chaos around him. The flashes from the reporters' cameras were like relentless, punishing blows. The board members in the front row were no longer looking at him. They were looking at their phones, their fingers flying across the screens as they texted their lawyers, their brokers, their publicists. They were not his allies, they were rats, and the ship was sinking with breathtaking speed. In that moment, he was utterly, irrevocably alone, exposed and stripped bare in the cathedral he had built to himself. A new figure rose from the front rows, a man with a shock of white hair and an undeniable aura of authority. It was Julian Croft. He did not need a microphone. His voice, honed by decades in federal courtrooms, boomed through the ballroom, cutting through the rising tide of chaos. "For the record," he announced, his gaze sweeping over the board of directors, "my name is Julian Croft, formerly of the SEC's Division of Enforcement. I have reviewed the evidence presented by Ms. Reyes, and I can attest to its authenticity. A full copy of this dossier, along with my sworn affidavit, was delivered to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York and the Securities and Exchange Commission 90 minutes ago. I suspect they will be in contact shortly." The words were a death sentence. The finality of them seemed to sever the last string holding Alistair upright. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a noise of pure, animal despair. He staggered back from the podium, his eyes wide and unseeing, a man whose ghost had just been exorcised in public. He was no longer a titan, no longer a king. He was just a criminal, waiting for his cuffs. The room erupted. Amidst the pandemonium, Elena stood perfectly still, a small island of calm in the storm she had unleashed. The weight of 7 years of pain and silent struggle lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a profound, quiet sense of peace. Justice had been served. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Elena Reyes finally exposed the truth. The weeks that followed were a blur of screaming headlines and legal fallout. Finch Capital ceased to exist, collapsing under the weight of federal investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and mass client exodus. Alistair Finch's perp walk was broadcast on every news channel, his face ashen, his expensive suit looking cheap and ill-fitting on his broken frame. He was a symbol, a modern Icarus who had flown too close to the sun on wings built from the stolen dreams of others. But Elena's story did not end with his fall. It was, in fact, just beginning. Among the chaos of that shareholder meeting was a woman named Sarah Chen, the CEO of a rival investment firm known for its strong ethical charter. She had watched Elena's presentation not with glee at a competitor's demise, but with a deep and profound respect for the courage and brilliance she had witnessed. A week after the meeting, she sought Elena out. She didn't offer condolences or congratulations, she offered a future. She asked Elena to join her firm not just as an analyst, but as a senior partner, to build and lead a new division from the ground up, a department of corporate accountability and ethical oversight, designed to use the tools of finance not to exploit, but to empower and protect. It was a chance to turn her weapon into a shield, to ensure that no other family would suffer the way hers had. Months later, the world saw a new Elena Reyes. She walked through a bright, open-plan office in downtown Manhattan, a space that buzzed with the quiet, focused energy of purpose-driven work. She was a leader, her voice now one of guidance and mentorship, her sharp mind dedicated to building sustainable, ethical companies. She had become a force for good in the very system that had been designed by men like Alistair Finch. Her true ascension, however, was not marked by a corner office or a new title. It was found in the quiet moments at the end of the day. The final scene of her struggle took place in a sun-drenched room in the finest long-term care facility in the state. She sat beside her father, Daniel Reyes, holding his hand. The antiseptic smell of his old facility was gone, replaced by the faint scent of fresh flowers. He was still locked within his own body, the damage from the stroke irreversible. But as she spoke to him, telling him about a small, family-owned business she had helped secure funding for that day, a company that reminded her so much of his eyes, clear and present, found hers. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, and the gentle, intermittent pressure of his hand in hers became a strong, steady, and sustained grip. It was a wordless message she understood perfectly. It was pride, it was peace, it was love. She had not just restored his honor. She had built a new legacy upon its foundations, one that would endure. Elena's journey was a testament to the quiet, unyielding power of the human spirit. It served as a powerful reminder that true strength is not measured in stock prices or square footage, but in the courage to stand for what is right, especially when you are standing alone. Her story teaches us that the most profound weakness of the arrogant is their failure to see the humanity in those they step on, and that a single voice, armed with the truth, can be enough to bring down the most formidable of empires. It is a story of justice, not as a final destination, but as a continuous fight, a commitment to balancing the scales, one righteous act at a time. The world is full of titans who believe they are untouchable, but it is also full of quiet heroes, waiting for their moment, ready to speak truth to power. If Elena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.